Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be showing you how I use my small scraps of fabric. So we're going to be making one of these patchwork patches, and I'm also going to show you how to make one of these with these scraps. So these scraps go on the front. You can see the cotton wadding or batting, depending on where you live, what you're going to call it. Here in the UK it's called wadding. I believe in the US it's called batting. Anyway, that's in the centre, and then on the bottom I have got a solid piece of fabric. So we're going to make one of these, so let's get started. It's always a good idea to set out your work area nice and neat with all the tools and fabrics you need close to hand. I have a big pile of scraps, and next to that I have some pre-cut wadding or batting squares, and they're 6 inches by 6 inches because that's the size that I have decided to do. You can do them any size you like, it doesn't have to be 6 by 6, that's just the size I'm using. You will need a rotary cutter and a quilter's ruler of some sort. I use a 6.5 by 12 inch or a 6.5 by 24 inch, and you can get most things out of those sizes, or you can buy individual square ones of the size that you require. And you'll also need a cutting mat and a pair of dressmaker's scissors. And if you have a small ironing mat, that will be very useful. It's much easier to have a small ironing mat next to your table that you're working at than having to keep going over to your big ironing board. And of course an iron to go with it would be useful. I like to keep a small container next to my sewing machine to put my offcuts of fabric. These are the very small pieces that you probably won't be able to use on another sewing project, but don't worry, there is a use for them. And you'll need pins to pin your fabric pieces together. Also, an unpicker or a seam ripper could come in handy. And last but not least, your sewing machine all threaded up and ready to go. Oh, and a pair of snips or small scissors. Cut out a piece of wadding 6 inches by 6 inches and a piece of backing fabric 6 inches by 6 inches. Then find yourself some offcuts of fabric. Put your backing fabric face down, so right side facing down, and then put your wadding or batting on top of this. We're going to be working diagonally, so lay your first piece of fabric at a 45-degree angle across your square. Next we're going to find a strip of fabric to go either side of the first one that we've put on. So just check to make sure that the pieces of fabric you find are long enough to cover all of the wadding or batting if you prefer. If any of the edges aren't level, you can trim them off to make sure that they are. When you're satisfied that your pieces of fabric are all the right length, take the second piece of fabric and lay it on top of the first one with right sides facing, and then pin in place. Notice which way the pins are facing. That's the first piece done. Then we turn the fabric round and lay our second piece down, and this time the pins will be facing in the opposite direction. This is because when we sew, we're going to sew up one side, turn around and come back down the other. So we want the pins facing in opposite directions. Take over to the sewing machine and sew down the first side, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance, removing the pins as you go along and backtacking at the start and the finish. When you've finished the first side, you need to flip your fabric around and then sew down the other side. The pins should be facing the right way because we put them the right way to begin with. So bacttack at the start and then sew all the way to the end, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance and then backtacking when you get to the end. Now give the fabric a quick press before going on to add the next 2 pieces. Then find another 2 strips of fabric, one to go each side. Again, make sure that they're long enough to cover all of the batting or wadding. Pin in place, again with right sides facing. Take your next strip and again put it over the one it's going next to with right sides facing. And again, we're going to do the pins in the opposite direction because we're going to sew up one side and come back down the other side. This way we can do 2 pieces at once and it makes life a lot easier. Okay, so at the sewing machine, sew down the first side, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance, backtacking at the start and the finish, and removing the pins as we go along. When you've sewn down the first side, turn the fabric around and sew back down the second side, backtacking at the start and the finish and taking 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then give it a quick press. Now we need to find a small bit of fabric for each side just to cover those last little bits of wadding or batting. So make sure they're going to cover it, and then pin them in place. Again, we need to put the fabric with right sides facing and then pin along the edge. Okay, so pin one side and then turn the fabric around and pin the other side. Again, as before, make sure that the pin is facing in the opposite direction because we're going to sew up one side and back down the other side. At the sewing machine, sew down the first side, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance and removing the pin as you go along. Then turn your fabric around, ready to sew down the other side, and sew, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now fold out the two side pieces and then give a press. Now all that we need to do is trim it down to size. So use your quilter's ruler and your rotary cutter and make sure you trim it down to your 6-inch square. The wadding does tend to stretch a little bit, so you might need to cut some of it off, but you want to end up with a 6-inch square. And there it is, one finished quilted square. The next square we're going to do is a completely random one. So place your backing fabric right side facing down and then put your wadding or batting on top of it, followed by your first piece of fabric. I'm going to put mine directly in the middle, and I should be able to put another piece of fabric either side of it. This is totally random, so you can do what you like really on this one. So I'm going to pin my first piece on one side and then I'm going to put another piece on the other side so I can sew them both at the same time and I don't have to keep going backwards and forwards to the sewing machine. If I can get two pieces down at once, then it kind of helps. So choose your second piece and pin that in place. As before, we're going to take 1/4 inch seam allowance and we're going to sew down one side and then back up the other side. So sew down the first side, removing the pins as you go, back tacking at the start and the finish. Now sew down the second side, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, press the two pieces that you've just added and then we can add two more pieces. So I'm going to add a strip on one side and a strip on the other side. Again, making sure that the strips are long enough to cover up all of the wadding and angle it at the right place as well. So when you've got it right, pin it in place and then find a piece of fabric to go on the other side and then pin that in place, again making sure that you're covering all of the wadding. It doesn't matter if you overlap some of the fabric, but if you can cut some of the overlap off. But if the fabric is dark enough, then you just won't see the fabric underneath. It's only where you've got a light fabric on top of a dark fabric that you need to worry about that really. Then take over to the sewing machine and sew your first side, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then turn your fabric around and sew back down the other side, again taking your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we just have the four corners to fill in. Of course, each time you do one of these squares, it will be different. It will never be the same. That's what I like about them. So just keep going around and cover up all of the corners, making sure that none of the wadding is left showing, and of course make sure you don't have any raw edges of the fabric showing. Now we can take over to our sewing machine and sew all of these four corners at once. So one at a time, and taking our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we just need to give it one last press. So fold out all of the corner pieces and then give them a good press. And then trim off any of the excess fabric with your scissors. Next, using your quilter's ruler and a rotary blade, trim your square down to 6 inches. As I said before, the wadding batting does stretch, so you might need to trim a bit off, but you want to make sure that you trim it down to the 6 inches. And here is our finished square. I really like this one. And this is the two finished squares together. Which one do you prefer? I definitely prefer the random one. I hope you managed to make some of these squares. And I forgot to tell you what I do with my very small scraps at the end of the day. So my last job of the day is to take a pair of scissors and chop up these very small, I'm trying to do it while looking at the camera, I'm going to chop my fingers off, and chop up these very small pieces of fabric and make them even smaller. I won't carry on doing that while I'm looking at the camera, otherwise I'm going to chop my fingers off. But that's what I do. I chop them into very small pieces and they all go into this bag, and when I've got enough, I use it for stuffing. In a later video, I'm going to show you what you can do with these patches. There are many things. You can make a quilt with them, of course, but you could also make pillows, cushions, bags, all sorts of things. Anyway, that's for another video. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, could you please like and subscribe?